everywhere we look nowadays, it seems like there's new kombucha to try, some new like fermented foods. People are like pushing yogurt down others' throats.
Yeah, I've heard a lot about the kombucha.
Yeah, and everyone's like getting really obsessed with this idea of having a healthy gut. But what does that even mean?
Why do we even care about bacteria in our gut?
The bacteria in our gut, there's thousands of different types of bacteria in our gut, and these bacteria actually are colonized at birth. So when you're born, you get a lot of these bacteria. These bacteria can depend on whether you have a vaginal birth or a C-section, if you're breastfed or not breastfed. And at 3 years old, supposedly you have developed a mature microbiota, which is basically just the measure of your bacteria in your gut. So bacteria in your gut have been linked to a lot of different diseases. They found that people who maybe are obese versus not obese, or I think even cancer patients versus non-cancer patients, they have a different like colony of bacteria in their gut. So people are really interested nowadays in what is going on in your gut and then what bacteria you have. And that's probably where this whole huge trend of focusing on your gut health has come from.
So I've heard of probiotics, but what are prebiotics? That's the word I hear a lot too.
Yeah, so prebiotics are really interesting because they are undigestible food material that like you'll take, and what it does, it basically feeds the bacteria that are in your gut.
Wow,
so it acts as
so
food
weird.
for them. I know. So you're taking
it's like
this
your little pet.
Right, yeah, because I mean I think there's billions of bacteria in your gut. And if you think about how much like genetic information is in each bacteria and you multiply that by like 1 billion, there's more genetic information going around in your gut than like what even is in all of our cells. So they need to eat.
So why is this becoming a trend now? I mean, haven't humans always needed to work with these bacteria to have a healthy gut?
Yeah, definitely. I think though recently scientists have discovered what's called like dysbiosis, which is basically where you have a strained relationship between your host bacteria and your gut bacteria. And this can be caused by aging, hormones, the foods you eat, just different environmental cues. And this dysbiosis has been associated with celiac disease, Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, and a lot of other intestinal disorders. And they've kind of said that this is linked to antibiotics, unhealthy foods that we eat every day, and also like food sterilization. So scientists are really interested in this topic because they know that the gut is super important. But what we really don't know is how individual like bacteria and probiotics can affect us.
Especially when everyone's bacteria are so different.
Exactly.
Depending on what food you eat.
Yeah.
It makes it hard to study.
For sure. That's why with this video specifically, as I was doing a lot of the research and reading, I actually reached out to a nutrition professor here at UNC, Dr. Carroll, to ask him kind of what he thought, because I mean we can go and read papers in the field, but oftentimes understanding where the field's at and what everyone kind of believes is hard from just reading a few papers. So a lot of what we are going to discuss today is based on some of the comments he had and just where he thinks the field is going. But he studies basically the gut microbiome, so he's a great resource for us.
So before we get into the science of it, what do people think about probiotics just in the media?
I think probiotics, people have always, like I always heard growing up to take probiotics from my doctor. If you were feeling pretty farty, they recommended taking probiotics. If you had antibiotics, they recommended taking probiotics. So I've definitely grown up being told to take them, and I think most people would agree. And I think today, though, at least with the media, there's a lot of claims being made about probiotics that may or may not be proven by the science yet. And that's kind of where you get into tricky situations of just why are you recommending something and what are the reasons for that. So are there any places where probiotics have been like shown to work in certain diseases?
Yeah, there's two in particular. So one of them is called traveler's disease, which is basically just like diarrhea. If you've ever been in a foreign country and had the order there, I might not agree with you. And also a disease called pouchitis, which is when part of the colon has to be removed because it's inflamed. So in these two cases, probiotics have been shown to be helpful for both of these kinds of diseases. I've also heard a lot that probiotics can be helpful after you take antibiotics. So I wonder if there's any merit in that.
Yeah, and that's one thing we kind of like looked at a lot, was just if this actually was the case, because you hear it, but does it actually work? So yeah, one of the questions in the field is, do the probiotics really help restore the gut microbiota after antibiotics?
It makes sense, because you take antibiotics and you wipe out a lot of the bacteria in your gut. So, taking these should help replenish, right?
You would think. So this one lab did a study. They gave humans antibiotics for 7 days, and then they gave them either probiotics, a poop transplant, or let their microbiota like recover on its own. And so they did a colonoscopy before the antibiotics and then after whatever treatment they were doing. To give a little introduction into the poop transplant, that's basically where you get some poop and you have it in a pill, and since your poop has all your microbiota in it, it acts to like completely restore your gut. What they found was that people who took probiotics, it actually took them longer to recolonize their gut microbiota.
Wow, that's the exact opposite of what I would think.
Yeah. And I think one of the reasons that they stated in this study was because a lot of times the probiotics, they will kind of go through transiently and they won't colonize, since there's already so many probiotics, so many bacteria in your gut already. And that's kind of the case with the probiotics too. Like, they have to be able to grab on, and for some of these, they just kind of transiently pass through. But they found that having the poop transplant worked the best to colonize your microbiota. And if you think about it, that makes sense. If you like donated some poop right before you have antibiotics and then take that poop after antibiotic treatment, you can just completely restore your gut.
Oh, so the poop is from the same patient.
I think in this case, sometimes it's from the same patient. I think in this case it was from other like donators.
I mean, yeah, it makes sense in general. Like with these probiotics, how do they even pick which bacteria to put in there? You might not be picking the right ones for this individual.
Right, and this study specifically looked at 13 different strains of probiotics like together in one capsule. And that's where, when I was talking to Dr. Carroll, he said that what needs to be done is people to do studies on just individual probiotics to be able to tell how it works for a certain person.
Right.
Because when you have 13 strains all together, it's super confounding to know what's working. So kind of one of the other questions in the field is if the probiotics actually can colonize your gut, kind of like what we mentioned earlier.
You mentioned that they can kind of latch on, but sometimes that's just transient. So do we know that people are even absorbing these?
Right, yeah.
Or is it just passed out?
Yeah, and that's the huge question. And the same researchers who did the antibiotic study also did a study looking at human gut microbiota along the gastrointestinal tract, so like along all your intestines. And they were trying to see if your absorption of probiotics was depending on who you are as a person, where you were looking in the GI tract, and also like what strain of probiotic you were using, if that had an effect. And they found that some people responded great to the probiotics they used. They used that same 13-strain probiotic. But they also saw that depending on what region you were at in the GI tract, it depended on if the probiotics could colonize. And even the strains you used really had an effect as well. And in this study, they did colonoscopies as well, which is kind of the gold standard in the field. A lot of people tend to do stool samples to measure probiotic levels.
It makes sense. You're measuring what's not staying in the individual.
Right. But the issue with those stool samples is if you're having those transient probiotics, you're just going to get those ones that have washed out and maybe not necessarily the ones that are actually colonizing. But the main conclusions from the study was that it's really person-specific what probiotics work for you, and also pretty strain-specific too, which is why it's important for scientists to kind of go into looking at specific strains of probiotics to see what works.
So if they study family members, is it similar for people that like maybe grew up together or have like siblings that have a similar diet?
I didn't look at that and didn't see it in any studies, but I'm sure they've done some, and that would probably make sense because you're having the same environment. You're probably eating the same food, because food does have a huge effect on your gut.
A lot of people are talking about the gut as a kind of second brain. There are a lot of like neurons that are interacting with that, and it's very much connected to your brain. So have people looked into whether these gut microbiota can affect your brain?
Yeah. There's been a lot of research on what they call psychobiotics.
Ooh.
Which sounds so cool. But they've kind of found that they did one test that I specifically looked at. They had mice do this persistent swimming test, which if you watched our last video, we talked about. And it's basically a measure of like your desire and will to go on, and almost like a measure of anxiety or depression. And what they did is they gave this mouse a probiotic with lactobacillus in it, which is one of the common probiotics. And when they gave it to the mouse, it like stayed swimming longer.
Wow.
So kind of like reducing those anxiety and depression symptoms. But what they did that was really interesting is they cut the vagus nerve, which is basically kind of controls like the interaction between the gut and the brain. And then they gave the mouse the probiotic and didn't see an effect in the swimming.
That's crazy.
Yeah, so they're basically showing that, okay, this probiotic worked through this one nerve and it affected the mouse's mood. So this was a kind of a good example of a study where they tried something, like one specific probiotic, and looked at it. I mean, I think they're really far away from being like, oh, here, take this bacteria and it will help your mood.
Right.
But just the fact that it has an effect is fascinating and could be a great way, I don't know, maybe to treat some depression in the future by prescribing certain probiotics. And
Right. Mm-hmm. So when they did this experiment, did they try it in different strains of mice? Because we have all these mice in the lab that are inbred generations and generations to the point where they're like basically genetically identical. But there are a lot of differences when you take one mouse strain and compare it to another mouse strain. So it can kind of be similar to what we think of as genetic diversity between individuals.
Yeah, and I don't think they did that in this study, which is definitely a limitation of it. But it would be fascinating to look at, like, I don't know, a lot of the other mice that are kind of genetically different that can be a good representative of the human population.
So all of this research seems like really promising, but why are we not there yet? Why are we not prescribing, specific probiotics to specific people?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I asked Dr. Carroll about this, and I kind of asked him about kind of the two camps that I saw through researching this. There's the one camp that says, okay, let's give all the probiotics and have all the fermented foods because it must help in some way.
Right.
But then there's the other camp where people say, we know the microbiome's important. We see these differences between people who have disease or don't have disease and how different their microbiota is, but we don't yet know how to treat people on like an individual basis. And I think that's kind of where the research falls right now because we know it's important, but just understanding the little nuances of how and why. We're not at that point yet where we can say, oh, well, you're struggling with this, why don't you take this probiotic and this should help you. And there are some other limitations too, at least, especially with like the kind of probiotic pills. If you think about all the bacteria in your gut, there's billions, trillions, there's so many. But when you're taking a probiotic, there's only maybe a few billion in a probiotic pill. So it's almost like a little drop in the bucket.
Right.
And it's not going to totally change the entirety of your gut. Like maybe some can hold on, but a lot of those probiotics are pretty transient. We kind of mentioned like just certain studies not focusing on one specific probiotic, but focusing on many. And I think having that research of just looking at the effect of one at a time really helps like with confounding.
Right, and maybe doing more studies in those mouse models where you don't have to worry about the genetics because you're just looking at one genetically identical strain can help us tease it out before we move into more complicated genetics.
Yeah, definitely. And also different people may need different bacteria, and it'd be awesome if we can get to a point where you take a test, you see, okay, I'm deficient in these bacteria that we know we need. But it's not one size fits all, and I think that's kind of how the whole probiotics field is at the moment. Is if you could just go down to Whole Foods, you get like 13 different strains stuffed in a pill, and it may help, it may not help. And even in the scientific studies, there's a lot of variability in how people are doing it. Some people take stool samples, some people do colonoscopies, and so within the field there needs to be a lot more homogeneity so that you can actually trust what's coming out of it.
Makes it really hard to compare one study to another when people are using different measurements, etc.
Yeah, definitely. I think the takeaway is just that we know microbiota is important and we know the gut's important, but we just don't know how to like specifically go on an individual basis. But if you want to try probiotics, definitely make sure that there's live cultures in the probiotics you get, because some companies will market it and say, oh, there's all these probiotics, but they say they've been like manufactured or you have to make sure that they're guaranteed at this time of use sort of thing. And there's also no federal standards of probiotics right now, so that's just something to consider if you want to try probiotics. I mean, it's up to you if you want to try them, but if you're trying something and it works for you, then maybe you were low on a probiotic and you needed that certain one. Like, I know for me, I still love my yogurt in the morning, not only for the taste, but I also feel like it makes me more regular.
It's also hard to rule out the placebo effect in this case as well.
Mm-hmm.
But hey, if it works for you, keep going.
Yeah.